You know how we often look at our own behaviors, things like perfectionism or overthinking, or even being a bit socially awkward, and we just label them as flaws? But what if that's not the whole story? What if they aren't really flaws at all? What if they're actually logical, predictable outcomes of how our brains are wired? Let's unpack the hidden psychology behind the things we do. It's a feeling we've all had, right? That sense of being misunderstood, sometimes even by, ourselves. You do something and people read it completely wrong. You feel one thing, but your reaction looks like something else entirely. Well, psychology gives us a framework to help bridge that gap between our internal world and our external behavior.
And really, this is the core idea we're going to dig into. On the surface, you see one thing, a behavior, but dig a little deeper and there's a completely different psychological driver at play. So what looks like perfectionism, that's often about having incredibly high internal standards. What seems like boredom, that might just be a brain that's starved for a little more complexity. And that social distance could be a cognitive mismatch where your way of thinking is just so different from those around you that connecting feels hard.
All right, first up, let's talk about the mind that just doesn't switch off. For some people, their brain's ability to process, analyze, and find patterns is absolutely immense. But that powerful engine definitely comes with a significant cost.
Now, this is super important. This isn't necessarily anxiety. For a highly analytical brain, continuous processing is just its default state. It's always replaying conversations, questioning decisions, and simulating future outcomes, kind of on autopilot. And as you can imagine, that consumes a ton of energy, leading to very real mental fatigue.
There's actually a term for this, cognitive depth. It's that constant, underlying hum of a mind that's just built to go deeper. And this explains so much, right? It explains why some people can feel completely drained, even after a day of rest, because their brain never truly stopped working. It was processing the entire time.
This reframes boredom in a really fascinating way. Think about it. When a mind that processes information super quickly is given simple, repetitive, or predictable tasks, it stops getting the stimulation it needs. And then what happens? Motivation just vanishes. So it's not laziness, not at all. It's a sign that the brain is under-challenged and is essentially powering down to conserve energy for something more meaningful.
Okay, next up, let's look at perfectionism. This one gets such a bad rap, right? It's so often misunderstood as being arrogant or just difficult, but psychologically it really stems from two very specific things.
The first is having those high internal standards we talked about, and the second is the clarity to see an ideal outcome. A perfectionist can vividly imagine how something could be, and that clarity makes the gap between that ideal and the current reality feel like a painful failure. It's not about ego. It's about the frustration of not being able to close that gap.
Now, a lot of our most ingrained traits aren't just about how our minds process information, they're actually adaptive responses to our earliest life experiences. This is a huge idea in areas like attachment theory, and it's especially clear when we look at independence.
And you can see the process here. Step 1. When emotional support in childhood is unpredictable, the brain learns a crucial survival lesson. Step 2. Don't expect help. To cope, it moves to Step 3. It builds this powerful system of self-sufficiency. So as an adult, that system is so deeply wired that asking for help can feel unnatural, uncomfortable, maybe even dangerous.
And the long-term effects of this are, they're profound. The nervous system can stay chronically on alert because in the past, being calm often just came before a problem. Rest can become associated with danger or neglect. There's often a deep-seated guilt for just having needs. And empathy becomes a guarded skill. You're still highly aware of others' feelings, but you're also fiercely protective of your own.
This brings us perfectly into our third theme, the internal compass. This is all about people who are driven way less by external pressures and way more by their own internal logic, their own values, and their own sense of who they are. Have you ever met someone who seems both incredibly ambitious and kinda lazy at the same time? Well, it's not a contradiction. These individuals often just resist effort that feels inefficient or disconnected from a meaningful outcome. Their brain is wired for efficiency. It's constantly asking, is this task worth the energy? If the answer is no, motivation disappears, even if that ambition is still burning bright.
I love this quote because it captures the idea of internal validation perfectly. For so many of us, our identity is tied to a group.
a sports team, a trend, a social movement. But for others, their sense of self is stable and it just comes from within. They don't need to belong to an external group to feel solid in who they are.
So why do they resist trends? Well, it's not about being a contrarian. Their minds rely on internal logic. They're asking, does this make sense? Not, is this popular? They value function over image and have a strong enough sense of self that they don't need a trend to define them. That fear of being left out just doesn't hit them in the same way.
And this extends to rules and authority, for sure. For a mind that operates on logic, because I said so is just not a valid reason. So that need to question is really a need to understand the underlying system, the why behind the rule. It isn't an act of rebellion, it's an act of analytical thinking. So let's bring all this together. The theme running through this whole explainer is that we can reframe our so-called weaknesses by understanding their real psychological function.
This table is a pretty powerful summary. That nervous laughter in a serious situation, it's often the brain's defense mechanism, a release valve for overwhelming tension. That feeling of being constantly misunderstood, it can be the direct result of thinking in more complex layers than a simple conversation can handle. Overgiving in relationships is often a learned attempt to become irreplaceable. And emotional distance can be a coping strategy, using logic to manage feelings that are just too intense.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. What if the things we struggle with, the overthinking, the sensitivity, the need for meaning, what if they aren't signs that something is wrong with us? What if they're simply the inherent cost of a mind that experiences the world with a little more depth?